So our upcoming presentation is Overcoming Obstacles to Historic Preservation in Your Community. Our speakers are, I have them in the correct order on the agenda. Hey, I'm impressed. Carrie Rhodus, who is an Ohio History Service Corps member. Carrie is a community surveyor hosted by the City of Cincinnati. And Tom O'Grady, Development Director at Southeast Ohio History Center. So I'm going to let them take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Let me get my screen going here. Maybe. There we go. All right. As Betsy mentioned, we are going to be talking about overcoming obstacles to historic preservation in your community. Let me minimize that. There we go. And so I'm going to start with just a basic introduction to what historic preservation is. As you can see here, there are a lot of different definitions to historic preservation. And so that makes it a little bit challenging to begin with because there is no clear-cut historic preservation is blank. I think my favorite one of these definitions is a conversation with our past about our future. And that's really, to me, what preservation is. It's an emphasis on, telling the stories and the history of our communities for those future generations and for the community as it exists now. But like I said, preservation means something different to everyone, and I'm sure Tom even considers preservation something a little different himself. So why do we do historic preservation? There are, I guess, four main pillars of why I think we should do historic preservation. And the first one would be to learn new things. Through historic preservation, we can look at history in different ways and start to ask different questions about the past. We can learn history ourselves, and historic preservation provides us with a physical artifact of the past to see, feel, and understand on a different level than just reading about the events in a book. And this is really good to teach future generations as well. Because the best way to understand is really to experience the past hands-on, and so this can be done by going into a space that connects you to the past. You experience the past, like I said, in a completely different way, and I know for myself and for a lot of other students, the love of history begins with visiting cultural resources. Cultural sites. I always tell the story, I fell in love with historic preservation when I visited the Library of Congress for the first time, and I laid down on the floor to take pictures of the ceiling. I love the building that much. And so we can also do historic preservation to celebrate important events, people, places, and ideas that we are proud of, but then also to recognize moments in history that are painful or uncomfortable, but that we still need to tell and, tell the full story and pass on those painful and uncomfortable moments to the next generation. So the majority of my presentation from here on is going to be talking about some misconceptions in the preservation field. Preservation has a bit of a bad reputation in communities because of a lot of this misinformation. And this slide is kind of a mess because these quotes are kind of a mess. And every single quote listed here is something that I personally have heard as a reason for why a property owner or a community member doesn't want preservation in their community. And quite frankly, most of them are completely based in falsehoods. So we are going to start with some of the falsehoods around historic designation. So first off, there are basically three different kinds of historic designation. The first would be nominating a building for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register currently has a little over 1.4 million resources listed. And these aren't just buildings, they're sites, objects, bridges, barns, any built aspect of the environment, be that construction or landscape, can be listed on the National Register. There is a standard that the property be 50 years old to be listed, but if a property has extreme cultural significance, it can also be listed a lot sooner. For example, the World Trade Center Memorial was listed almost immediately because of the huge cultural importance that that site holds to our country. There are 4 criteria for listing a property on the National Register. You only have to meet one of the 4, but a lot of properties do meet 2 or 3. The first criteria is that the property is associated with a significant event on a local, state, or national scale. The second is that a property is associated with a significant person. Again, that can be local, state, or nationally significant. The third is the property's design characteristics. So this is what most people think of, the high style architecture, but also construction techniques. So for example, a innovative truss design for a bridge can be listed for criterion C. And then the fourth one, we don't use too much because it is the potential to yield information. And so that's primarily used for archaeological sites. And so the National Register is primarily just a way to get recognition for your property. There isn't really any limitations that are placed on your building site at all with National Register listing. The only time there are any limitations is if a federally funded project would affect that property, then it goes through a Section 106 review. And if an adverse effect is found to be had on the property in that review, then there are chances to mitigate those effects before proceeding with the project. But other than that, there are no protections involved with listing on the National Register. You can still even demolish the property, no questions asked. The second main historic designation would be a National Historic Landmark. And these are a subset of the National Register listings. They are about 3% of the National Register listings are National Historic Landmarks. And these are properties that are nationally significant, and those properties are then recognized by the federal government for that significance, and the National Park Service gets involved to help with some of the maintenance on those properties. But again, there are no restrictions. They can still be demolished. And then the third designation, and probably the most protective designation, would be a local designation. And these can vary based on your locality because they are set up by a community's preservation ordinance. Most ordinances are based on the National Register criterion and the Secretary of the Interior standards. And so there's not too much variety there, but most of them follow the same guidelines that I spoke about already. And the difference is with local designations, you have a local review board that reviews major changes to the property and demolition permits, and either approves or denies those based on how they would impact the historic material and significance of the property. That being said, even with a local designation, it is still possible to demolish your property. There's just one extra hoop to jump through there because you do have to prove that you cannot receive a reasonable economic return from the property as it is. But I've definitely seen that happen before. And if depending on who the applicant is, it's somewhat easy to do. As I mentioned already, listing does not really protect your property at all from demolition. Other than the economic return option, if a property is declared a public emergency, it will also be demolished because it is just, quite frankly, no longer safe to be standing. And so a lot of property owners that don't want to preserve their properties will do what we call demolition by neglect. And they will just neglect that property until it is declared a public emergency and the city does require it to be torn down. And then the other way, that I would say the most common way for historic properties to be torn down, is through illegal demolitions. Our fees that are charged, fines that are charged for demolishing a property, are very, very low. I have seen them range from $90 to $100,000 at the extreme high end. But when you have a multi-million-dollar deal going on, and this pesky little building that's historic is in the way, you're not really too concerned about $100,000. And so a lot of buildings do get demolished very quietly in the middle of the night to make those deals go forward. And so I personally think that our cities should ramp up those fees to help prevent that more in the future. When your property is listed either on the national register or through a local designation, that does raise your property values, which is another big misconception. A lot of people think that listing your house will decrease the property value, but the opposite is true. In historic districts, we see owner occupancy within the district go up on average 30%. Sales prices go up on average somewhere between 14 and 23%. The assessed value go up between 5 and 35%. And the properties also appreciate faster, somewhere between 4 and 19% a year. So really, just in every aspect of the term property value, your properties do increase in value when they are listed. And so last, I just wanted to talk a little bit about easements and covenants, because I just told you all these ways that historic designation doesn't really protect your property. And so easements are a way to protect your property. Easements are a legal agreement that assure preservation in perpetuity. They can vary, again, based on the specific wording of your document, but most of them restrict demolition and inconsistent changes, and require maintenance obligations so that you don't have that demolition by neglect. And if the easement is violated, the owner loses the property and it goes back to whoever holds that easement, which typically is a preservation or local history organization. The other way easements can be used are short-term easements. If you have received a preservation-related grant for your property, there is often an easement attached to that for a short amount of time to make sure that you complete what the grant requires you to do and you don't just turn around and reverse all of those changes right away. So the next big section of impacts or of misconceptions are environmental and energy efficiency related ones. There is a pretty common belief these days that new is better, period. And that's just quite frankly not true in terms of building materials. The lifespan of a modern construction home is 60 years, and the lifespan of a traditionally built home is 120 years. And you can go to a home inspection website and find a material lifespan chart pretty much on any one of those websites. I've included a link here if anyone wants to find one now. And these basically just show that in every aspect of building, your doors, your windows, your lumber, the traditional building materials have a much longer lifespan than modern building materials. But perhaps what is more important to me is the waste that we produce in construction. It is estimated that every year we produce 2.2 billion tons of construction waste globally, which comes out to about 4,300 acres every single year of landfills that are just construction waste. 90% of that construction waste comes from demolitions. So the more buildings that we are able to save right off the bat, there are much less materials going into those landfills. But new construction typically wastes about 30% of the total materials, just from, the end of a board that you cut and you don't need the end of, and things of that nature. So really, if we do need to tear down a building, it is very important to do deconstruction instead of demolition, and contact local architectural salvage companies who can come in and take the good materials and resell those to be reused, and then also just to recycle anything that can be recycled. Last on that section, our building construction contributes 39% of our annual CO2 emissions as well. So lots of climate change issues there. Speaking of climate, our historic properties were built for the climate in which they are located, which often means that they are a little bit of self-regulating, and so you don't need to use quite as much of your central heat or air in order to heat or cool your property. So, and this is done through site orientation, either attached or detached outbuildings, the thickness of your walls, the fireplace location, functional shutters. Those are personally my favorite aspect of a historic property, because you can keep your windows open but your shutters closed, and that keeps the sun out, but you still get a nice cross breeze all over your house. The width of your roof eaves, porches, even the color that you paint your property. And the historic buildings all had these thoughts in mind when they were constructed, and so they are really built for their environment. And then last on this slide, I just want to talk a little bit about windows. The most common thing that we replace in our historic buildings are windows, and we throw away 112 million window sashes every year in this country. But the problem is modern replacement windows are designed for obsolescence, because window companies want to keep selling you windows. And so in order to receive a return on the energy efficiency that you save with a modern window, it takes about 23 and a half years to see that return financially. But after about 20 years, you're going to need to replace those windows again. And so you never really see a return. And so it's better overall just to repair your historic windows, because as you can see in the top chart here, the light gray is leakage at your windows after routine maintenance and repairs to those windows. And so you can see that just by doing some routine maintenance, you can really shut down or slow down your energy loss in those windows, if you really have energy loss to begin with. Why is my slide not progressing? There we go. And so real quick, I also just want to throw in a little note about fighting climate change. With historic properties, the most common threat that's climate change related is to flood-prone sites. We have historic properties are traditionally built closer to water sources, which leads to bigger flooding problems. And so, first of all, flood insurance is insanely expensive. And so if you can do something to mitigate the risk of flooding in your property, that will have a big effect. The top two photos here are the Farnsworth House, which is a historic property that they actually had routine flooding, and then they created a hydraulic lift system. So in the bottom picture, you can see that the whole house has actually been raised up out of those floodwaters. And so getting creative with our ordinances to allow for these environmentally friendly changes like flood mitigation, like solar panels, will really go a long way. And then lastly, I just want to stress the importance of having an emergency preparedness plan for your historic property as well, to make sure that you don't lose a lot if there is a natural disaster that's related to climate change. The other important aspect of historic preservation that is often misconstrued is the economic impact. I already talked about property values, but generally, preservation is actually more cost effective. When you preserve a property instead of building new, you create more local jobs because preservation is more likely to use a local workforce, whereas new construction materials can be shipped in globally from anywhere in the world. Historic preservation also tends to lead to an increase in heritage tourism. Our global value of heritage tourism is over $1 billion annually. And this leads to more economic diversity in the community, as there are more relationships between businesses throughout the community. You're able to share the wealth. The image of your town can improve with tourism, and that leads to more positive feelings by the residents who live there as well, because they like that people want to come visit, and that makes them have a little more pride in their community. You also have a little bit of an actual cost savings when you preserve instead of building new. Typically, renovating and preserving a historic property uses about 16% less money and 18% less time than new construction. And so even though everybody thinks preservation is really expensive, it actually dollar for dollar tends to be a little bit cheaper. And the material and quality of workmanship that you see in historic properties would be astronomical to reproduce in today's world. Lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about tax incentives. If your property is listed on the National Register, there are the opportunity to receive the historic tax credits for your renovation project. There is a 20% federal credit, and in Ohio, we have a 25% state credit for any qualifying rehabilitation projects. And so that can really cut down on the costs of your preservation projects. And if you are like a nonprofit and don't benefit from tax credits, you can sell those credits. The current going rate is about 80 cents on the dollar. So you're not really losing too much overall. And then I just wanted to highlight the Main Street program, which I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of, but basically it is a membership program to revitalize downtown through preservation-based economic development. And as of December of 2019, they have reinvested, the thing popped up, there we go, $85.43 billion into the local communities that have Main Street programs. And you can see all these other lovely statistics of the impact they have had. And basically their entire platform is based in these 4 core ideas of economic vitality, design, promotion, and organization. And if you go to the Main Street America website, you can actually find their catalyst strategies, which are ready to use ideas for each one of these cores that are just on their website, free for any community to use, whether they are a member or not. And then real quick, so I would like to ask each of you in attendance to help me fight some of these misconceptions in the future. First of all, the general public needs some help because a lot of people don't really even know what preservation is, or if they do know preservation, they just know the misconceptions that I spoke about. Related professionals also have some trouble, particularly real estate agents don't often know what it means to sell a house in a historic district, and they can actually scare some people away from buying historic properties. Architects often don't know the benefits of preservation in their design projects, or you have contractors who don't know the techniques of preservation-friendly renovations. And so we really need to help educate others. And then, of course, the next generation, most preservation professionals don't know that preservation exists until we sort of fall into it by accident. And so by teaching youth that this is a career field and this is an option, we can definitely diversify the field more and get more people engaged in history and preservation altogether. And I will turn it over to Tom now and stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Let's see. All right, so I suppose you all can hear me.
Yeah, you're fine, Tom.
Okay, thank you. So I couldn't agree more with all the things that Carrie just said. And, the issue of climate change, a lot of people don't think about that kind of thing associated with historic preservation. And I think a lot of times when we think about historic preservation, we mostly think about big buildings in downtown areas and public buildings and millions of dollars and lots of regulations. But I think we need to think well beyond that. Our history defines us. That's how I see it. And so it's part of what defines us is the buildings and the trees and the things in our environment that we are around every day. That and the people we're around. And when those things disappear, part of us disappears with them. So it's kind of obvious when people want to preserve magnificent big old buildings like the Carlisle building in Chillicothe that burned and stood empty for 15 years, but got put back in service. And it's big cities where you hear a lot about historic preservation because they have a lot of buildings, but they're also the ones who are losing the quickest. I just happened to be in Chillicothe the other day, and goodness, it's so nice to be able to see so many nice big buildings. And when I go to a place, that's what I want to see. I'm not really looking for Walmart. There was one when I left home. So things like that are important, but they're not the only things that are important. Factory buildings, industrial buildings, and our homes, and not just the big homes. Here in Chillicothe are a row of shotgun houses that tell us a little bit about the story of people in Chillicothe. Matter of fact, almost all of our old buildings tell us so many different stories about our communities, about who we are as people and as a state and as a nation. These shotgun houses would have been built by Black folk who were brought up during mine strikes during the era and brought their cultural baggage with them, just like the houses out in the landscape and the barns. There are very distinctive types of structures out there, and they're built by people representing them. So I think historic preservation, we have to see it not as Carrie indicated, some kind of thing that we have to fight. It should be an opportunity. training programs. You know, we need skilled people. Where are you going to learn skills but to fix the old best stuff we ever built? And as they say, history is a catalyst for economic growth. Communities with cultural heritage institutions and a strong sense of history and character, they attract talent, they increase tourism and revenues, and they enhance business development and fortify local economies. I love this quote I saw at the State House. The degree of civilization and knowledge prevailing in a community is always clearly designated by its works of art and none by more than its architecture. And I guess when I look at any community, a big city or a small town, the architecture that I'm looking at is the stuff we inherited. There are people trying to build good things today, but for the most part, as a society, we're not building heritage worth preserving. Lots of people live in the big cities, and that's where I said a lot of that stuff's disappearing, but it's the small towns and countrysides that things are disappearing too, one by one. And it doesn't seem like a big deal when one house disappears or another, but the cumulative effect of that is that we have an ever changing landscape. And so the things that we take for granted as common are really part of our story. And it's important that we get to know some of this stuff. Little houses that we might see as low income housing happen to be part of our heritage. You know, in this case, these are miners' shacks, and other times they're company houses, and some other places they tell some other story. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't know that, we let them go too easily. So I guess we might live in a neighborhood where nothing's historic, and so we don't know much about the neighborhoods that surround us either. So all these old things, they have a lot to tell us, especially small towns. Like this little building here, it's easy to drive by it repeatedly over and over and over again. But then I heard that it was the colored man's store. Well, that made me ask a lot more questions. You know, was this where colored folks had to shop, or it was owned by a black man? And what did he do there? And one of the things in my existence, the more I learn about something, the more important it is. Like a building. You can go buy a building 1,000 times, and if it's just an old building, it's just an old building. But the minute you find something out about it, it gets a little bit more important to you. And the more you find out about it, the more considerably more important it got. It's just an old little shop there along the side of the road. Doesn't seem important today, but how many people depended on that for their life, for groceries, way out in the boondocks? A little garage like that. That's not important, is it? Well, they're not making any more like it. It's made of native materials, and really, it would probably not be much more expensive to fix it and keep it than it would be to demolish it and dispose of it. So it's about the way we look at things. And that wouldn't cost millions of dollars, but it would still be historic preservation. And what it does is it helps us protect our sense of place, which is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge every day with the expansion of urban sprawl and shopping centers, all of which look pretty similar. This is the old Free and Accepted Masons building in Chester Hill. You can still see the F and AM in the slate on the front top of that building. Just last year, they lost the IOOF building that had a very similar front to it. What a sad thing. A piece of everybody in town got carried away. Now here's just an average little house covered with siding in Athens. Take the siding off, find out it's a log cabin, and it was the first courthouse in Athens. So it's about finding out about these things. It's about education. That's just a little building. Wouldn't be any problem if it went away, or this one. But then when you find out about them, and I can't say I know about all of them, but they all played a functional role in our communities. Barns in urban areas. There's still barns in some urban areas. They harken back to the time when people traveled in horses and buggies. This is an interesting little kind of common little house in a small town in southeast Ohio called Colton. What's so important about that little house? Oh, and it needs work. The paint's coming off, the windows are slipping out. The day I took these pictures, it was 2 degrees above zero. Well, it just happens to be the birthplace of the longest serving governor of the state of Ohio. It's got a lot of history in that house. He was born there. Elsewhere in Colton, I while I was there, I went up and looked at the cemetery. Unfortunately, we don't take as good a care of cemeteries as we ought to. And I stumbled on the grave of this little fella here, Samuel Llewellyn. He was one of Andrew's raiders in the Civil War, part of the great locomotive chase, one of the first persons ever awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And you could go through that town 100 times and not know he was there. Matter of fact, I'm not sure who in town who lives there know he's there. And there's another little building in Colton. Doesn't seem very impressive. I know it's a low income rental at the moment, but if you look back, you find out little bits about it. And it was in this building, the Miners Supply Store in Colton, that John Patterson worked. And he understood by working there the value of the use of a register. So he left Colton and went to Dayton and established one of the largest companies in the world, employing thousands of people with national cash register. But that's where he got his start. And it's one thing to put up a little marker or a monument nearby, but some people, they want to experience the thing. I remember talking to David Fayette in Fairfield County, and he said, he takes his kid and or his grandchildren up, and he reads these markers, these historic markers to them, and he can't keep their attention, but he takes them in a barn. They can smell it and taste it and feel it and hear it. And like that with any building. As a matter of fact, here's a building he worked on. This is an old building on a cliff. Well, it's abandoned for over 100 years. You get a little information about it. It was built in 1829 and abandoned in 1899. What good is it? Well, somebody thought it was worth something, and so it's been rehabilitated. And they are now grinding corn there again. This is a wooden building that was abandoned for over 100 years. Just another little building in the landscape. We don't know about these things, but when we find out about them, they become more interesting and more important to us. Barns. Barns were the most important buildings in Ohio's landscape for most of the first century. Why? Because they protected the harvest. Nothing else was going to happen in Ohio without a harvest. And so these barns are important, but the evolution of agriculture made them less important for use in agricultural purposes. So the challenge is to repurpose these things. These things, there's no 2 barns in Ohio that are the same, but there are 3 traditional barn types that tell us where people came from. The New England barns, the Pennsylvania barns, and the Southern barns. And once you know that, you'll see variations on every one of those, but every ride across the state of Ohio then becomes a history lesson in the settlement history of the state of Ohio. It's pretty amazing. And what's in these barns? Well, inside of these barns is the primeval forests of Ohio. We think they're gone, but they're not. Just look at that one piece of siding missing there, and it's revealing that's an old double crib log barn. That's telling us something about not only the people who built it, but of the materials in the landscape that were used for it. So the primeval forests are not gone. They're holding up the roofs of all the barns and mills and many of the factories in the state of Ohio. And when you look at the craftsmanship inside these things, we don't even know who the barn builders were. They just came in and they built all these barns. And how many were there? A lot more than there are today. And since we don't value them maybe the way we should, some of them are returning to the landscape, but some of them are being taken apart and shipped to other parts of the country because other people do value these things. This is an interesting thing. These are called marriage marks on these timbers. They were designed where this one was supposed to fit that one. So those are some of the earliest barns in the state of Ohio. It's called scribe rule timber framing. They evolved out of that fairly quickly to square rule timber framing and could build barns a lot quicker. Inside every barn in Ohio is a veritable woodlot of primeval trees. These were all cut and hand hewn before the Civil War. People want to get in these barns, but they don't know it. But once they get in, they want to go back and they want to get in as many as they can. Sometimes you think you're in a church. Is that a sculpture or is that just a beam holding a roof up on a barn? Now here's a rather nondescript looking barn over in Western Ohio. Well, what's so important about that? Well, you go in, you see that's an old barn. And people were campaigning in there, pushing for Henry Clay at the time. That's pretty old. Look at the size of that board there. That board, you can't get a board that wide anymore. That comes out of a primeval tree. Now, this building isn't on the National Register of Historic Places, but it certainly ought to be on the local register of historic places. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. You know, there's a lot to be said in these old barns. Here's somebody's tally marks when they're counting their sacks of grain or whatever it was. You can identify these barns by the saw marks. These are parallel saw marks from a sash saw or a pit saw. Here's when the circular saw came into being and after the Civil War. There's so much information in every single old building in Ohio. But until we learn it, we stand to just lose it. And then there's all the other buildings on the farmstead. The barn was so important, but all these little things. And until we look at them and see them and study them and find out about them and ask questions, we don't know what role they played. There are granaries and spring houses and what have you. And they're all important. What are people going to know in 2 more generations about an outhouse? They'll be all gone. Maybe we save things because they're one of a kind, like this hand-cut stone barn in Monroe County, Ohio. Or maybe because they're last of a kind, like this bridge in McConnellsville, Ohio. I know when I grew up, bridges were part of the skyline of almost every village and city. And now we cross rivers on pre-stressed concrete spans and we can't even see the water. So how do we preserve these things? I think we need to start looking at things differently. Now here's a really nice old bridge crossing the Muskingum River connecting Duncan Falls to Philo just a couple years ago. Well, it just got replaced. They built a new pre-stressed concrete span. There's a canal lock here. It's a really historic site. And just this past month, they dynamited the bridge into the river. Here's an old WPA bridge built across the Hocking River. That was dynamited back in 2005. Here's a humpback covered bridge, lasted over 100 years, and it was burned by arsons in 2010. This is a humpback bridge crossing a railroad track in New Concord, Ohio, that is preserving its S bridges, but this one they let go. And there's how many hump bridges over the railroads are there anymore? So I think we need to look at variety, not just one thing, but many things. Here's a WPA bridge that could probably use some attention. You have to find these things too. And then there's other things like traces. Oh, skip that, but there are bits and pieces of the Zanes Trace, the first federally funded thoroughfare in the state of Ohio. You can still actually find the wagon tracks. And it's more important to preserve those things in some cases than to put up a historic marker saying it used to be here, but now it's an 8-lane highway. But these old roads, and there's many of them, stagecoach roads and post roads that, you know, the new roads diverge from the old one, and you can still find some of these old wagon tracks. You know, in these places, you know, they're not just the experience of the people who live in these houses or work in these buildings, but the people who pass them. It's part of all of our experiences, and unfortunately, everything is subject to change. So let me just skip this here. I'm not sure why I put that there, but so many different kinds of houses, and we need to look at them. And trees, you know, trees build America. You know, there's an attitude about trees in America. You know, if you're a tree hugger, there's something negative about that. And yet humans have depended on trees from everything from the cradle to the coffin. and the wooden stir spoon in between, and the food that they give us, and the soil they make, and the air and the oxygen that they create. And so we need to be looking at trees. Everybody ought to be a tree hugger. Who wouldn't be a tree hugger? And why? And then, of course, the special ones. These are the ones that have survived more than anything else. So their genetic material ought to be passed on. Here's a tree in the city of Logan, Ohio. Every school kid and everybody in that town knows that tree. What happens when that tree disappears? Everybody gets to lose something in that case. And then there's all these little ruins around, parts of a mining operation. Here's some old mine buildings in Cincinnati, Ohio. These are particularly scheduled for demolition this summer, because we're not creative enough to think that maybe we could just make these things, instead of seeing them as liabilities, maybe they are assets, and maybe we could remove any dangerous places here and cut back some of this invasive species, and we would have an industrial park with some trails amongst the buildings and some interpretive markers that tell us who built these things and what they did in these buildings. And this is basically everybody in Chansey, their father, their grandfather, and their great-grandfather built and lived in these buildings. And to demolish them would be such a loss. And if we can't see these things as assets, I mean, how far do people travel to see ruins in other parts of the world? Pretty far. And they pay a lot of money. Here's the old mine superintendent's house right in town. The company store still standing. They can tell a whole story there if they don't demolish it all. Here's a National Park Service brochure of Fort Laramie. And I noticed there's a couple of historic buildings here, or ruins, I should say, that are being preserved. So it's not something we're making up. And all of our industries, you know, I like to always remind people, Southeast Ohio is where Ohio began. And the people that came here and settled here and built all these amazing communities and farmsteads, they also harvested the resources that built much of the rest of the state of Ohio and other parts of America. So maybe we should be preserving the ruins. Here's an old pile of grindstones that was rejected at the grindstone quarry when the grindstone business was a big deal, when they were sharpening tools for agriculture everywhere. These kinds of places, they're important. And yet what happens is somebody discovers these, they go in and they start plucking out the grindstones one by one and selling them to people who live in subdivisions and put them in there at the foot of their driveway. And they don't have
Let me leap in here, Tom. I'm sorry. We've reached time.
Oh, okay.
And I have a question in the chat that I want to pose to both you and Carrie, because I have a feeling that you have a bunch of great stories and we could be here until like 3 o'clock this afternoon. So,
well, I didn't plan to go that long.
We do have a question for both of you in the chat about how you have personally been involved with historic preservation in your community.
Well, I've been involved in trying to educate people about some of the values of these things. I've also been trying to help preserve the Athens Asylum. I think I wrote my first letter to the editor in defense of the Athens Asylum back in September of 1983. And it's been a 38-year tug of war since then. It's not an easy thing. I think Carrie pointed out some of the stumbling blocks. You know, people have to see the value of these things, and a lot of times we don't. I think education is one of our most important tools. So I spend a lot of time educating people about the value of our heritage.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I think it all goes back to education. In my position with the Ohio History Service Corps, I do what I call capital P preservation with the city's Urban Conservator's Office. And so I do historic inventory forms of historic properties all over the city of Cincinnati. But then in my private life, I do what I call lowercase p preservation. The house that I live in was a rural church. The foundation dates to 1832. The timber on the wall frame of the house is 1874. But in 1949, it was converted into a house. And so now it has vinyl windows and aluminum siding, and you would never know that it was a church. And so a lot of, well, first of all, we're trying to restore the house back to what it looked like before. But we, a lot of what we do is just try to tell the community, you know, the road is called Chapel Road because this was the church. And just educating people really about everything from, you know, the Carew Tower in downtown Cincinnati to these small, tiny shacks that Tom has been showing us.
So yeah, that, which actually, on some level, Tom alluded to what was my question. So there's a level at which you're both preaching to the choir here, right? We are the people who love old buildings. That's one of the reasons we're here. And Carrie, I think you addressed this to some extent. You know, so what are some of the arguments for preserving old buildings to people who aren't necessarily history geeks, right? I wonder if, you know, there were any like strategies that folks can use.
I think, in my opinion, the biggest strategy for me would be to just take these people into that old site and get them to experience it firsthand, and like Tom was saying, to smell and taste and just experience that site. I don't know how anybody can't fall in love with these buildings, but if they still don't, then you start throwing some of the numbers at them.
I think it's important that we educate people about the buildings. They're just old buildings until they know something about them. And I think the more you know about a building, the more important it just becomes, or the site, or even another person. If you don't know them, they're a stranger, they're not that important to you. But the minute you get to know more about anything, it just becomes more important. So education's critical here. And I think Carrie's discussion earlier about the misconceptions about it. And I guess I would say, you know, we think that what we need to preserve are things on the National Register. Everything doesn't merit that, and they're not going to get on it anyway, but it doesn't mean it's not important to our local communities. And so we need to have our own local registers of historic places and remind ourselves of what's important to us.
All right, sorry, I was also typing, which is a, all right. Thank you so much, both of you. We now is our moment to learn more about a couple of specific historic sites. And I again, thank you so much for presenting. I think it's we were partially inspired by a former Alliance board member who has moved on to a position in community development, community economic development. And she had had her Facebook page that she found that she talked about historic preservation so much more now than she used to in the history community. So it was a thing where I wanted to make sure that you know, we started talking more about it. So thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
So now I am going to start with the Spotlight site. I'm going to stop recording